Subcommittee on Intelligence and Counterterrorism will be in order. The subcommittee is meeting today on examining the operations of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank my colleagues from the Committee on Homeland Security for joining us both in person and online for this important hearing to discuss the current and future state of the Department of Homeland Security's Office of INA, or Intelligence and Analysis. I want to welcome back Mr. Kenneth Weinstein, who is testifying before us this morning. After serving as our nation's 4th Homeland Security Advisor, Mr. Weinstein is intimately familiar with this committee, and we are glad to welcome you back in your new role as the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at DHS. As a former CIA officer, I understand the importance of the role that intelligence plays in preventing and mitigating threats to the homeland, and in developing long-term expertise on issues and supporting the policymaking process. INA's contributions to the intelligence process are particularly important as the office has a unique responsibility, unique among the, I think, 17 different intel agencies across the U.S. government, to provide intelligence to our state, local, tribal, territorial, and private sector partners who, in many cases, are on the front lines of keeping Americans safe. INA's mission success is dependent on effective information sharing capabilities with local partners to address these dangerous threats. However, we know that INA has often struggled to consistently achieve mission success. DHS is our newest cabinet-level agency, just born with 9/11. So we are all invested in INA's success. We want to make sure that we understand INA's information sharing to state and local partners, make sure it's timely, make sure our communities are getting easy access to intelligence, and we want to make sure that some of the concerns raised by the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, recently in their preliminary report that focused on some of the products right before January 6, 2021, the day that the U.S. Capitol came under attack. Make sure we understand some of the sharing practices, since some of those products were not made available until days after the attack. So we are interested in hearing from you, Mr. Weinstein, as you are in, I believe, your 6th month of taking the helm here. What are some of the issues you're focused on? How are you making sure that places like INA are not politicized in any way, that it lives up to the intelligence community tradition of being nonpartisan and providing support to whoever is the commander-in-chief, whoever is in leadership? And then help us understand some of the concerns that have been brought up in these various investigations. We are particularly, I was pleased to hear you say, Undersecretary, during your Senate confirmation hearing that you are committed to the production of, quote, objective, unvarnished intelligence, and that's your first focus as Undersecretary. We all believe that that's the mission of INA, and today I hope we have an honest, robust conversation about how we address those issues, how we help from an oversight perspective to make sure that for the American people, for the stakeholders invested in INA's success, we all feel that you're able to do your best work to keep the homeland safe. And I just want to say that I believe this is the final hearing of this subcommittee's work before the end of the year. Throughout my time as chairwoman, we've had really wonderful staff support. We've worked with the department, with other federal agencies, and I want to thank Ranking Member Pfluger for being a good partner in this committee. So as we move into a new Congress, I hope that the work that you're going to put on display for us is something we can take forward into the next Congress and continue to develop that relationship for the betterment of the department and for the people of the American public. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I agree with your sentiments. And it has been a pleasure to serve on this committee with you, and I appreciate your leadership, the staff's participation, and the I think the ability to look at some of these issues in what I hope will continue to be more of an apolitical, nonpartisan view focused on security. So last month, at our full committee hearing, we focused on worldwide threats to the homeland, and Secretary Mayorkas testified about foreign terrorist organizations seeking new and innovative ways to target the U.S., ongoing cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure, and emerging technology like drones being weaponized to cause harm, so many other threats. Perhaps more now than ever before, we must depend on our intelligence professionals to anticipate, to detect, to identify the countless threats that we are facing. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis was tasked with the important role of leading the intelligence enterprise, composed of DHS components, as it navigates that complex threat environment. And it seeks to mitigate threats before they become costly or devastating to Americans or to our homeland. Per statute, INA also serves as the intel community's primary liaison to state, local, tribal, territorial, and private partners, as well as the conduit for information exchange within the many components of DHS that rely on timely and reliable, accurate intelligence to execute their own mission sets. And being someone who served in the military, I know this for a fact: intelligence can be invaluable when properly vetted and delivered to the appropriate stakeholders prior to the escalation of a threat. However, I do believe INA has struggled, as the chairwoman has said, in a couple of areas, potentially identifying and disseminating pertinent intelligence. And whether we call these failures or some other adjective, having been investigated by DHS OIG, which has found that INA identified pertinent specific threat information on several occasions, but in some of these cases failed to produce any reports on these threats until clearly past the point of mitigation. For example, we'll go back to Portland, Oregon. Prior to your time, INA published several intelligence reports on U.S. journalists engaged in ordinary journalism protected by the First Amendment and leading to public outcry. DHS later acknowledged, rightfully so, that these reports were misguided and eventually recalled them. Though a comprehensive DHS administrative review on INA intelligence collection and dissemination activities in Portland found no evidence of politicization, it did uncover a host of other alarming issues that undoubtedly played a role in these high-profile intelligence failures. The DHS review found INA suffered from understaffed and overworked personnel, high turnover and decreased institutional knowledge, lack of oversight and leadership in some cases, and training gaps that left employees operating without an informed direction or knowledge of the policy. In the Portland incident, junior collectors with less than ideal guidance and very little oversight were sent into a volatile situation with enormous pressure to produce intelligence products before they had mastered the core competencies of their own specific duties, leading to intelligence reporting on journalists rather than the real-world threats. And conversely, in other situations, open source collectors discovered potentially actionable threat intelligence prior to escalation, but fell short in the critical mission set of sharing that information with law enforcement partners because they were, again, unclear on the department's intelligence reporting policy and requirements. These sorts of incidents led to public confusion, anger, and even ridicule, which only exacerbated the morale of those within INA, many of whom had extended their working hours, covering 24/7 shifts and truly working overtime. I look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Undersecretary, on where the morale on the rank and file members is today and what leadership has done to right the ship. And like so many other members of the IC, INA is granted the authority to collect intelligence through publicly available sources. Having multiple agencies collect and disseminate intelligence from publicly available internet searches and other law enforcement public releases can offer limited value and at times could be redundant, duplicative, as we mentioned before the hearing started. A recent DHS OIG review of nine INA finished intelligence domestic terrorism products released over a one-year period showed 6 of the products contained information that its partners could have easily found. And I hope that during this hearing today that we'll be able to talk about where we have a duplicative or overlapping gathering system. And we can have that open and honest conversation to know where INA can be most effective going forward. In the 2 decades since the attacks of September 11th, the intelligence apparatus has evolved greatly, and I'm glad that it has, as the chairwoman served in one of those agencies. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence, including the National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC, has been established, and the FBI has refocused considerable attention and resources towards the counterterror mission and enhancing their information sharing relationship with law enforcement partners. And DHS component intelligence branches from CBP to CISA have been bolstered. It is incumbent on us to assess and review at this time the performance of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis and consider steps to update and rebalance its role and responsibilities to ensure that the value is what the American people not only deserve, but what our hard-earned taxpayer money is going towards, eventually with the goal of continuing to keep the homeland protected. So it's with that that I hope we have a great hearing. Thank you for calling this, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Members are also reminded that the subcommittee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member of the full committee in their February 3rd, 2021 colloquy regarding remote procedures. The chair now recognizes Mr. Weinstein. I'm sorry, just making sure we don't have Mr. Thompson or Mr. Katko. The chair now recognizes Mr. Weinstein for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Slotkin, Ranking Member Pfluger. Very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, or INA. And it's an honor to be here, but it's really an honor to be here representing the dedicated and high-caliber intelligence professionals at INA. While my statement for the record includes a very comprehensive sort of overview of what we're doing at INA right now, over the next few minutes, I'd like to run through some of the key points describing INA's mission and its management and oversight. In terms of mission, first, and very fundamentally, as an intelligence agency, INA's primary function is to carry out each stage of the intelligence cycle on behalf of its customers, setting requirements, collecting against those requirements, reporting on that collection, and then disseminating those products to our partners. In terms of dissemination, INA is currently modernizing how we deliver intelligence to our partners. This year, INA rolled out a mobile app, which allows our customers, police on the beat, in their squad cars, to access products on their phones, making it a lot easier for them to get real-time access to intelligence. We're also piloting a project that distributes laptops at the secret level out to our cleared partners so that they don't need to be tethered to a fusion center or to an office to get intel. Second area that I want to focus on, and that is a critical part of our mission, is intelligence partnerships. As Secretary Mayorkas often says, DHS is fundamentally a department of partnerships, and we've taken a number of recent steps to energize our relationships. For example, we recently established a Deputy Undersecretary for Intelligence Partnerships, which has elevated that engagement function within our organization, and that person reports directly to me. We started hosting bi-weekly meetings with our state, local, territorial, and tribal partners to discuss the threat environment that we all face. And in August, as an example, we hosted a National Intelligence Summit with the IACP, which convened over 100 partners, police officials from agencies, associations at all levels of government to reimagine and discuss information sharing efforts in the future. So in addition to the intelligence cycle and intelligence partnerships, a third and absolutely critical mission has been building and enhancing the management and well-being of the INA workforce, something that you both very appropriately mentioned. I'm particularly encouraged by our recent progress, both before and after my arrival here, in bolstering morale and organizational health. This progress includes, A, a focus on enhancing diversity initiatives. We live in a diverse world, and it requires a diverse intelligence workforce, and as such, we consider diversity a core value. Second, we've re-envisioned our telework program and flexible scheduling to attract and retain talented personnel. Third, we're improving employee communication and different mechanisms therefore, including how we receive feedback from the workforce, which is so critical to self-examination, which is so needed, and progress. Fourth, we've instituted initiatives to bolster employee morale. We launched a speaker series with speakers like Jim Clapper and Stacy Dixon, and in October, we held the first INA Family Day in almost 10 years, patterned after what the CIA has done for many generations. And then finally, knowing that this committee has placed a special focus on the quality of INA's training, we've made substantial progress in enhancing our training efforts over the past couple of years, including development of oversight training that covers INA's authorities, the intelligence oversight guidelines, and whistleblower protections. And in addition to training its own staff, INA has expanded training opportunities for intelligence personnel in other DHS components and among our state and local partners to the tune of almost a 300% increase in 2021 alone in terms of the number of people who've taken that training. These training efforts are being done in tandem with the formulation of a rigorous process of oversight. In response to the findings from the reports that you all mentioned, INA has worked hard to instill an oversight culture that is intensely focused on analytic integrity and on the protection of privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties of U.S. persons. In 2021, INA doubled the size of its intelligence oversight branch, which provides training and advice on the Attorney General-approved intelligence oversight guidelines. It also conducts compliance inquiries and reviews all of INA's intelligence products, finished intelligence. We've hired 2 career professionals as full-time ombuds who help resolve individual and organizational concern in the workforce without fear of retaliation. And it's also important to note that DHS's offices for civil rights and civil liberties, privacy, and the general counsel are all heavily involved in our oversight efforts and review all of our finished intelligence products. To ensure that our organizational decisions are aligned with our long-term strategy, we're also currently carrying out a 360 review of INA's activities, and this goes to something that you said, Mr. Ranking Member, taking a look at where we stand today. And we're doing that with the help of 2 distinguished national security professionals who are studying the organization and engaging with stakeholders to ensure that we're adapting and aligning our resources to meet the evolving threats. Should we identify room for improvement in that process, we'll work closely with Congress on the authorities and resources we may need. And for instance, with our FY23 budget, we've made particularized requests to expand our analytical cadre on a range of growing threats and to invest in technology that we need. So to conclude, I want to thank you for your continued support and your continued guidance. As I trust you can see from our summary, INA remains committed to enhancing partnerships, to reinvigorating our information sharing efforts, to improving the way we deliver intelligence to our partners, and to maintaining an intense focus on enhancing oversight, training, and morale across the organization. Thank you for the honor of appearing before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Without objection, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement by the National Fusion Center Association. Thank you for your testimony. I'll remind the subcommittee that we will each have 5 minutes to question the witness. We have just a handful of us on, so we'll likely be able to do a few rounds. I'll now recognize myself for questions. So we are, of course, interested in morale and training, but could you give us, and C-SPAN, the meat and potatoes? How many analysts? What kind of production do you have per month? Who is your principal customer? And then give us some illustrative examples of what you're producing so that people understand not just how your workforce is faring, but the value proposition for the American people.
That's a great question. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. So to step back and sort of take a high-level view to begin with, INA's value proposition, this goes back to its origins in 2002 when it was first stood up by statute, was to help make sure that all the players in the Homeland Security enterprise, be they federal agencies like the intelligence community, DHS, DOJ, FBI, and all our partners out among the state and local law enforcement, territorial and tribal entities, and the private sector, that we're doing our best to share relevant information across all of those partners. And that is one of the lessons, as you recall, of 9/11, which is that we didn't connect the dots. But connecting the dots was more than just not taking one data point and seeing its relevance to another data point. It was not having the intelligence channeled from one person who had the information to somebody who could act on it. And as you know, one of the main concerns was that our state and locals were not part of the federal process of intelligence sharing. That's our main job. Our main job is as a bridge to the state and locals. And that's one of the reasons why my statement for the record and my comments just now focused on what we're doing to cement that relationship, expand our regular communication with state and locals, be they police forces, sheriffs, first responders. And our analysts, not only are we building those relationships, but our analysts focus on the kind of threat information that is going to be relevant to those partners.
So just to help us understand, how many analysts currently work for your shop?
All told, do we have a final number now? Yeah. I thought it was a little over 300, somewhere in the 300 range is in terms of pure analysts, out of a workforce of about 1,000, including 300 contractors, 700 feds.
Okay. And how many pieces of finished intelligence generally would you say that 300 analysts produce per month?
I don't have that number exactly.
And can you give me an example of just one or two pieces that have gone out, understanding classification? Just tell us what you can, so that the average person, my dad who's sitting at home, who's in the hot dog business, understands what INA does.
No, happy to. And this sort of follows on from my previous comments. Finding intelligence that is relevant to our state and local partners. So, for instance, is right in the aftermath of the abortion decision that came down from the Supreme Court. And as you recall, it sort of came out suddenly on a Friday. It was unexpectedly early. We convened a call with all the stakeholders around the country, but we also put a piece out which just raised the concerns about possible violence in reaction to that decision. And it explained what we'd seen in the past, from which violent actors we've seen it in the past, and what we're hearing now about whether those violent actors are going to react to the decision. As you recall, it's relatively peaceful, but it was very well received because it just sort of laid out, these are the things to look for. Similarly, one other example, you recall the FBI, the attack on the FBI out in, I believe it was Cleveland, after the Mar-a-Lago situation, where sort of an individual came in and tried to attack an FBI office and then was killed. We also put something out talking about threats to law enforcement around the country, calibrating whether that threat was focused only on federal law enforcement, the FBI, because of this Mar-a-Lago situation, or whether there's a broader threat to other law enforcement.
And then just lastly, so Mr. Pfluger referenced some of these things in his opening statement. If you're sitting at home in Michigan right now, every single person I know knows someone who's been the victim of a ransomware attack or a stolen identity, some sort of cyber threat. Have you done production on cyber threats? Have you done production on counter drone threats or drone threats? The things that sort of the American people think about as a potential problem. What's the level of production you've done on those things?
Quite a bit. And on the cyber front, we're embedded with and working very closely with CISA and on cyber and critical infrastructure in general, but we put out a good bit on cyber, put out some products on ransomware, because that is the kind of issue that the average American really needs to be thinking about. In fact, in our fiscal year 23 request, we've asked for more cyber resources because of the criticality of that threat.
And then lastly, can you describe in as much detail as you can how INA is handling the issue of domestic terrorism?
Hugely important question. We're very focused on domestic terrorism. As you know, everybody from the DNI to the FBI director to Alan Mayorkas at DHS has said that the primary terrorist threat today, the most lethal, sustained threat, is from individuals or small groups here in the United States. We still have Al-Qaeda and the foreign terrorist organizations out there who are a real threat. But in terms of lethality, right now, that's the main threat. And so we're very focused on that, and we see ourselves as playing a critical role in that effort because domestic terrorism of that type, whether they're domestic violent extremists or homegrown violent extremists, they're the kind of targets where the state and locals are apt to be the first to find out about them. So they need our strategic intelligence to know what to look for out on the street, and then we need to get from them what they're seeing so that we can couple that with intelligence from other parts of the country to zero in on the bad guys. When I say bad guys, I'm talking about people who are engaging in violence. That's the key, right? And so we're heavily involved in that, including our collection process, not just our analytical process, but our open source collection, where we target collection against people, once again, who are fomenting violence. This is not spouting political views or religious views, it's violence. And so that's an area where we see an expanding role with the expanding threat.
Well, I'll come back to that because I'm interested in that collection part. The last time, with your previous acting undersecretary, it was more like, I think 2 or 3 bodies had been expanded, but there wasn't any clarity on what exactly was happening, particularly on the collection side. But I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Pfluger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Secretary Weinstein, I'm happy to hear you talk about how the role of INA is to be a bridge to the state and local. And so I think I'll start just with a broad question. I mean, what makes INA unique in the IC? Where is the most value added of having INA? And what should we as the American public be looking at INA as nobody else does this, and here's why it is critical?
It's a great question, sir. And I guess I'd encapsulate it this way. As I said in response to the chairwoman's questions, we have the statutory responsibility, we alone have the statutory responsibility to be the intelligence bridge to the state, local, territorial, tribal, and private sector partners around the country. So that is our function. We have other functions too, and I've listed our various facets of our mission, but that really is the key. And so that is what we do, and this goes back and addresses the failings, which were sort of highlighted by 9/11, where we had insufficient coordination between the state and locals and the federal entities. And so that is really our key mission, and that's why, for example, we've created the new position of Deputy Undersecretary for Intelligence Partnerships to highlight the need to keep those relationships strong and vibrant. And that is why I mentioned earlier, and I think you actually alluded to this in your opening remarks, we are stepping back right now and doing a 360 review of INA. And what that entails is taking a look in the organization, seeing where it adds most value to our partners, particularly the state and locals. See where maybe there are other agencies that can handle those responsibilities as well or better than us. And then, if so, consider shifting our resources to an area where we really do add more significant and unique value.
I think that's fantastic. That's exactly what we're looking for, to reduce the duplicative nature that big government has really become, not just in this area, but overall. And keeping on that statutory mindset, when we look at the authority that you have and the 24 responsibilities approximately that the office has, I personally have not seen an explicit provision for collection on open source data. And I'd like you to elaborate on the authorities and the justification drawn from the Executive Order 12333, if you will, to build out such a large collection capability, and why INA has strayed into that area of open source collection, vice focusing on the 24 other authorities.
Good question, sir, and this sort of goes to what we alluded to in our earlier conversation about how we should focus our resources in those areas where we add value. So statutorily, we're authorized to do intelligence work against the threat, the Homeland Security threats, and consistent with a departmental or national mission. And in terms of 12333, we're allowed to do open source collections, but it's overt, and it's only getting access to publicly available information. So we have no covert means at our disposal. So that's a very important caveat. We have an open source collection office of about 10 people and 1 supervisor, I believe is the number now. So it's not huge, but it's consistent with our authorities. We have very heavy oversight, and part of that is an outgrowth of the situations you talked about earlier, where we had Portland and then January 6th. The lessons learned from that resulted in us embedding an oversight officer in the open source collection group to make sure that they are available to answer all questions, because that can be a dicey area. You're talking about privacy interests, even though it's publicly available information. So We do have the authorities. We're exercising them with strict oversight in fidelity to the oversight guidelines that were authorized by the Attorney General, and we're doing so pursuant to departmental missions, in particular to terrorism and other national security threats.
If we get to a second round of questioning, I'll go down a path that deals with some of those last points. Do you believe that there is and thank you for the answer, and thank you for the review, because I think it's critical that we do this 360 review, that we get to a point where INA has an area where you're focused and you're adding value to the IC where no other organization can do at the level that you intend to, these types of jobs. But do you believe that there is a question, a public question, or a perception problem with some of our intelligence gathering apparatus, the IC in general, when it comes to that line and that friction point of privacy?
I think that's inherent in intelligence collection domestically. I mean, we are a democracy. Our government operates best when it operates transparently. By definition, some of the intelligence enterprises conducted clandestinely, not transparently. And as a result, there's always concern, and there should always be intense scrutiny on the activities of the intelligence community, especially when they're focused internally here in the United States. And I will say that, be it here or before the intelligence committees where I've been testifying, my mantra has been, give us the authorities, give us the resources, but give us the oversight responsibilities. Impose oversight, because the best situation is where both Congress and the American people have the means to have comfort that the authorities they're giving to their intelligence community are being used appropriately.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from the great state of Michigan, Peter Meyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Undersecretary, for being here. I just want to ask quickly on the National Terrorism Advisory System. Replacing that color-coded HAS system from that immediate post-9/11 period, but we continually state and use the phrase heightened threat environment, heightened and heightened. As anyone who travels through the airport also knows, we have the TSA liquids rule, that 3.4 ounce maximum. Originally in 2006, after we foiled that plot to have liquid explosives on airliners, that was initially supposed to be temporary, right? The ratchet goes in one direction. I'm just curious from a general standpoint, if it's heightened relative to a baseline. And is that baseline pre-9/11? Is that baseline just some sort of fantasy of safety that we've had? And would you ever see your department putting out an advisory that says the threat environment has diminished or that we're returning to a baseline?
Well, thank you, sir, and appreciate the question. Very nice to meet you. That's an excellent question. I will say, personally, I was in government dealing with the post-9/11 response up until I left Inauguration Day of 2009, came back in after 13 years, and that's one of the questions I had. I had the sense that the level of concern about terrorism had diminished in relation to other threats, but I wasn't sure about that ratchet issue. Don't know that I have an absolute sort of absolute answer in terms of what will happen in the future on that. But I think one thing that might be illustrative is the most recent bulletin that we put out. Just went out 2 weeks ago. And we debated, okay, so we don't have any triggering event that suggests that there's a threat that's heightened over what we announced in the last bulletin 6 months before. But it's still at a heightened level. And so what we try to do is make very clear that we're putting that out as a bulletin. In other words, as an update, not as an alert. Hey, everybody, take note of this. We see this credible evidence that there's a new threat or a newly heightened threat. Rather, we're still in a heightened threat environment. And given what we've seen of late, I think that's the case, that we're still heightened. But that sort of ducks the question a little bit of heightened from where. And I take your point that maybe at some point we should step back and say, maybe today we're in a new reality and sort of recalibrate that system.
And it's probably an unfair question, but just that question of where do we establish a baseline? I mean, you still walk into stores and there's mask required posters up on the wall, nobody's wearing a mask, right? I mean, it's that if it becomes the intelligence advisory bulletin that cried wolf, it just fades into the background and then risks not being received. But again, that's just something I always keep in the back of the mind on the intelligence side, because it's so easy to put out an advisory. It's very difficult to, it's easy to say, be worried or be cautious. It's very easy, it's very hard to then face the consequences if you're wrong and there was a risk that hadn't been appreciated. But just quickly on the clandestine intelligence collection side of the house, can you speak to how INA deconflicts the various streams coming in and avoids circular reporting, which I think, especially in the clandestine realm, given the necessity of protecting source information, is especially an acute risk?
So, good question about the deconfliction. There's always a concern about deconfliction when you have multiple agencies, frankly, multiple actors within individual agencies doing intelligence work on the same target. Just to be clear, we do not do clandestine work. And we work very closely with the Bureau. That's probably the main place where that opportunity might arise, to make sure that they know what we're looking at, we know what they're looking at, and to the extent that they, let's say, have an investigation going on, that we don't issue anything that would be problematic for the integrity of their investigation. But since we're not running sources, in the classic sort of clandestine way or using covert means, it's a little less of that specific issue is a little less of a concern for us.
Okay, so largely dependent on the FBI or whoever that clandestine authority is to be pursuing their own deconfliction rather than on the analytical back end.
Right. What we do on the analytical back end is if we're, let's say, getting intelligence from NSA or the FBI that is, covertly collected intelligence, we make sure to deconflict with them to the extent of making sure we're not disclosing something in a classified or unclassified form that could be problematic. So we do that, but we draw on their intelligence, put it into a format that is appropriate. Sometimes we then downgrade it, because back to our sort of original function of trying to serve the state and locals, oftentimes we'll take classified and downgrade to unclassified, and obviously we need to get their opinion on the appropriateness of that downgrading.
And I see our chairwoman is not here for the moment, so I'll just say just want to make sure from a terminology usage, clandestine, where the role is masked versus covert, where it's never acknowledged in terms of the ultimate source of the information or the ultimate collector of that information. But I guess I will yield to our ranking member, Mr. Pfluger.
Chairwoman has stepped out momentarily, so we'll proceed with the second round of questions, and when the chair returns, we'll hand it back. But now recognize myself for another 5-minute questioning period. Thank you for the first round of where your mindset is. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and understand what you believe the definition of domestic terrorism or domestic violent extremism is.
So that's a good question. I think it's very pertinent, and we have to constantly remind ourselves of that. And one of the purposes of this oversight apparatus that's really developed over the last couple of years, and it's quite comprehensive. I invite you, to ask further questions about that or come see it. But one of the main purposes of that is to make sure that in the terrorism space that we are only collecting, we're only monitoring, we're only issuing intelligence when it comes to the possibility of violence. So in terms of domestic terrorism, as I mentioned earlier, we have domestic, homegrown violent extremists who are homegrown extremists who are inspired by foreign terrorist organizations or foreign terrorist rhetoric. And then you have domestic violent extremists who are US-based individuals or small groups who get radicalized without inspiration or without direction from overseas. And both are legitimate targets for intelligence collection and production for INA. But the key is, and this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of our ability to act on it, is it can't just be somebody who's talking about an extremist political view. That's perfectly protected by the First Amendment. It can only be somebody who is coordinating, moving toward, discussing the possibility of violence. And that is the key element in the definition of the type of domestic terrorism that we can collect on.
Well, thank you for that, and I think it is important. In your 360 review, would implore you to make sure that the people that are assigned as officers or employees of INA understand that and make sure that the rhetoric that we hear at times is not helpful on a political level, but it's not helpful for our country either. And, when you get to some of the threats that we have seen, you mentioned the Dobbs decision. Do you believe that the threats that were made against certain religious organizations or pregnancy help centers in that aftermath were terroristic?
Yes, if you look at the definition of terrorism, threats or acts of violence intended to shape public opinion or influence policy, there were such acts, yes. And we, in fact, I think the document, the report that I mentioned earlier highlighted some of those. And we have done a lot with the faith-based community to discuss these threats, the possibility of them, whether related to that particular Supreme Court decision or not. We've seen a lot of faith-based victimization over the last few months.
Well, we certainly have, and obviously the anti-Semitic comments and violence that has played out in places like New York City and otherwise are extremely harmful. Kind of getting back to, and thank you for those answers. And as you look at your workforce, something that was previously mentioned, can you kind of talk to us about maybe the breakdown of the skills, the growth rate from 2002 until now of INA, and where those positions, I think you said you have 300-ish analysts, what are the skill sets that you've hired, and what is that, growth rate over the past 20 years on a year-to-year basis, if you know that?
A good question, and that's something that I'm learning as I'm getting into this position, learning the history. And I will say a number of my predecessors did a very good job of bringing in and recruiting strong people. We have really strong analysts. I mean, that's one thing I've been impressed with since I've come on board. These are people who care a lot, they know a lot, they work well with other agencies, which is really a key element of a job description at INA. You've got to be able to work well with other agencies and are smart analytically. So, but I will say that we have really ramped up the training program over the last few years. And I've gone back and looked at the same reviews and reports about Portland and January 6th, and there were concerns about the sufficiency of the training. And that's one reason I highlighted this, and one reason I've appreciated this committee and Chairman Thompson's focus on training over the last few months since I've been engaging with the committee, because that's the key. I mean, you can bring smart people in, and we have a tremendously successful internship program that brings these whip-smart young kids in college. They work for the summer, and then a high percentage of them come on board permanently. And they're great. They're great raw material, but it needs to be shaped. And that takes training and experience and mentoring. And so we're really focused on that.
Do I have 30 seconds? Do you believe that MAGA supporters are terrorists?
No, a MAGA supporter in and of itself is not a terrorist at all. A terrorist is somebody who seeks to use violence or the threat of violence to shape public opinion, to influence policy. And I can tell you that at INA, we're very focused on that concern. And just to broaden the question out here, the issue, the challenge here is that a good bit of domestic terrorism grows out of political views. That's inherent in your question, obviously. And the challenge for the intelligence community and law enforcement community is making sure that you protect the right of people to believe whatever they want at either end of the spectrum, as extreme as they want to believe, and only focus on those people who take those beliefs over the line to radicalization and violence.
I'm looking forward to telling my 90-year-old grandmother that she is not a terrorist. And I appreciate your answer. Yield back.
Thank you. Sorry, I had to step out for a final vote in another committee. Staying on the topic of domestic terrorism, right? I'm of the belief, I think as you are, that no matter who you are on the left or the right, if you are espousing violence, that's where your freedom of speech ends. And you should be held to account no matter what your views if you are threatening or using violence against other American citizens. But there is also a ladder of escalation that people climb short of violence that is indicating behavior of a problem. In Michigan, we have had double the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the past year in 2022. My own synagogue just had an incident last week where a man stood outside, screamed death to Jews. This is the place where my grandparents helped build this place. And when the police officers pulled him over afterwards, as long as he didn't have a weapon, he was good to go, and they fist bumped him and he went on his way. We're having a huge community conversation about this in Metro Detroit tomorrow. And when I go to understand anti-Semitism and the rise of incidents in my state, I don't go to the Department of Homeland Security, INA. I go to the ADL. I go to other organizations. So tell me what production you have done on things that may be short of violence, but are indicators that violence is on the increase.
That's an excellent question, Chairman Slotkin, as it relates to how you identify somebody who should be looked at. But how do you do that without monitoring someone who's just exercising the right to free speech? And we actually have been involved in putting out a set of indicators, radicalization indicators, to all our partners around the country to help them identify those things that suggest that somebody might be radicalizing toward violence. It is the truism in our country that you're allowed to speak your mind and your opinion, even if that opinion is abhorrent, so long as it doesn't foment violence and it is not intended to coordinate violent attacks. So we have, in addition to those indicators, we have put a good bit of effort in the houses of worship area because they have been a target recently. And I think Ranking Member Pfluger just mentioned the New York situations recently that we've seen. And we can get you the products that we've done on that. Happy to do so. Also, I've been involved working with a number of faith-based groups, and we actually have a DHS level faith-based group that draws on members from all around the country to talk about these issues. I've been focused on that in particular in the anti-Semitic area where it's been, we've heard a number of these hate crime incidents recently. Happy to get you those materials, though.
Yeah, and I'm happy to take them. I guess my point is we're having this huge community meeting tomorrow, which unfortunately I have to miss because I'm voting, but it includes obviously the local community. The FBI will definitely be there. Our Attorney General will definitely be there. The ADL will definitely be there. Is the Department of Homeland Security not part of that conversation? I guess it just strikes me as like, if you want to be relevant and be in the game, it's not just about handing someone a piece of paper or a finished Intel piece kind of to show that you've done the work, but it's to push it out and make it available to a wider audience. And as the chairwoman of a committee, the fact that I go to non-governmental agencies to learn about the Proud Boys, which we had a real problem with. My district is where the raids happened for the plot to kidnap and kill my governor, right? So it's a real thing for us on the ground, but the government agencies, I understand it's a sensitive issue, but I couldn't feel more strongly about the importance of you all getting left and right limits, being really clear about it, and then coming up to proactively talk to us about this issue, because no one wants to go after someone for free speech, but when you've had a double the incidence of anti-Semitism in my state, the question remains, like, what is my government doing to help my population? So I would just put that on your radar. Having it in your back pocket is not as useful as being at the table.
No, I take your point, and in fact, what I was trying to say earlier about how we've enhanced our engagement with our partners, a large part of that is with the faith-based partners, and there's not a First Amendment concern with us going out and explaining to organizations like the ones you cited, and explaining what we see as mobilization indicators or radicalization indicators, which, as I said, we put a product out, but we actually do try to get out to the table. So if you have meetings and you don't see us there, or one of our people at the fusion centers, where you have now people at, almost all our fusion centers around the country, and I've been spending a lot of time, I was just out with the folks in the field in Texas, and they're very embedded with the local groups, including the faith-based groups. So
Well, we'll be
let us
looking
know.
for the DHS presence at this large community meeting tomorrow in the Metro Detroit area.
Okay.
I yield to Representative Meyer.
Madam Chair, I just asked a question, but I'm happy to yield to Representative Langevin, who I believe is also on the
Sure.
line.
The chair yields to Representative from Rhode Island, Jim Langevin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to hold on questions for now. I'll just join the hearing. So I was in the House Armed Services Committee markup. So just joined, and I'll hold on questions for now. Thank you.
Okay, I think with that, anything else from my peers here? We're very keenly aware that we've got 2 intel officers and 1 military officer staring you down, and we could nerd out with you all day on these issues, but in fairness, just checking with ranking member, are we good to go? Okay, I appreciate your time in coming down here. We will enter into the record your opening statement. And I would just offer, since this is the first time you're appearing in front of this committee, it will be changing hands come January, that many of us serve on various committees, and there are agencies and departments that are proactive about coming to Congress, and there are those that wait to be asked. And given the IG reports, given the sort of short history on INA, my strongest recommendation, particularly on domestic terrorism issues, is to come up early and often be open kimono about your rules and left and right limits, and help this staff understand, because as you see, it's a sensitive issue kind of both ways. We want you to be doing this work, but we don't want you to be violating anyone's freedom of speech. So your help in being proactive in the next Congress would be appreciated. Okay?
You can count on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming.
Take care.
Madam Chair?
Oh, yes, Representative Langevin.
Yeah, if I didn't realize we're going to be adjourning questions. If it's okay, I will go with 2 questions.
Sure. Please, go ahead.
Okay. In July, DHS OIG released a report entitled "The Office of Intelligence Analysis Needs to Improve its open source intelligence reporting," and the report was the result of an OIG audit to determine the extent to which INA has an effective process for collecting, managing, and collecting open source intelligence for operational and intelligence purposes. So the OIG found that while INA has made recent efforts to address challenges related to insufficient guidance and technology, additional processes improvements are needed to ensure effective intelligence reporting. So if we could ask, what steps we're taking to address the issue, and do those steps involve plans to draft new policies, revise training, and upgrade technology?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, the open source office is one of the areas of our intense focus for 2 reasons. One, because there were issues that were spotted there in the context of the Portland and Capitol attack situations. But 2, because they're going to be so critical to so many of the threats that we deal with in the future. And we just talked about domestic terrorism as one of them. And so before I got there, many steps have been taken to enhance training. There's a mandatory open source training class that was instituted, very comprehensive. We embedded an intelligence oversight officer down there among the 10 or so people who were on that group to give them sort of hands-on, direct, immediate guidance on the various issues about privacy that they encounter day in and day out. We actually have, and this, once again, before I got there, assigned the members of that group to particular portfolios so they get to understand the issues, aren't just generalists, but they're focused on particular threats, so they become more expert They're more able to like separate the wheat from the chaff. And we are also looking at resources. One of the issues that I do want to talk to Congress about, both now and in the future, is how we would deploy more resources for that group if and when we need to deal with the different threats, many of which are carried out over social media and through publicly available information. So that's an area of intense focus, and happy to keep you, sir, and Congress informed of what we're doing in that front.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, and look forward to having that follow-up. Let me shift gears for a minute. Now switching over to a cyber issue. How does the Cyber Mission Center within the Office of Intelligence and Analysis coordinate with the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, in the delivery of cyber intelligence products? Because I think that kind of coordination is really important, and I'd like to help us understand how that fits.
That's actually an important sort of operational question that occurred to me as soon as I started looking into INA before I was even nominated. The CISA uses a good number of our analytical resources. We have analysts embedded over at CISA doing cyber work and cyber threat intelligence work. And we work with them. I actually had a call at Jen Easterly before I came on board to talk about how that works, whether that's the most sensible approach or whether it makes more sense for CISA to have their own organic intelligence cadre. To date, it's the reports we get from both operationally within CISA and from our people is that relationship works really well. We bring the analytical expertise. The CISA has the innate cyber expertise, and it works well, and we're getting the information out. I just talked to Jen about this 3 days ago, and there's some of our colleagues had a meeting yesterday on this very issue as to sort of exactly how that deployment should work. So we're looking at it fresh just to make sure that in that absolutely critical area, we're putting our best intel foot forward.
Thank you for the answer. I mean, that kind of coordination is very important. It really needs to be seamless. We get obviously better product and out of coordination. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and that my time is about expired, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Langevin. I see Representative LaTurner has come on. Representative LaTurner, would you like to ask a question? Okay, we'll come back to him. Representative Jackson Lee, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Well, Ms. Jackson Lee, are you there? Or Mr. LaTurner? Going once, going twice. Okay, any other further questions here? Okay, and unless I'm hear from one of the two folks who are on screen who are not asking to be recognized, the members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witness, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The chair reminds members of the subcommittee that the record will remain open for 10 business days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.